Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Betsy Boughton, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the 8th presentation in this series of 11 webinars focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. The goal of this series is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session. Please type your questions for Justin in the Q&A tool at any time during or after the presentation. And today's webinar will conclude promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon, Results and Insights from the Western Great Plains. And today's speaker is Dr. Justin Derner, a Supervisory Research Rangeland Management Specialist with the USDA-ARS in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Dr. Derner's research interests are to determine the potential of adaptive grazing management and the contributions of flexible stocking strategies to the sustainable intensification of livestock production in semi-arid rangelands, and to provide land managers with information and decision tools needed to maintain profitability and environmental sustainability and reduce risk to livestock operations in a changing climate. So now I will turn it over to Justin and we'll hear the presentation followed by the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today in the USDA Climate Hub's LTAR webinar series on grazing land management and soil carbon. My name is Justin Derner. I'm a rangeland scientist and also the research leader for the USDA Agricultural Research Services Rangeland Resources and Systems Research Unit headquartered in Fort Collins, Colorado. My topic today is results and insights from the Western Great Plains. If we look at rangelands, they're very important in the global context. Greater than 50% of the Earth's land surface area are rangelands, lands that are characterized by being non-cultivated, largely grazed by cattle, sheep, and goats for livestock production and provision of other ecosystem goods and services. Despite their large land area, they contribute little in terms of soil carbon sequestration because their rates are low, from 0 to about 0.13 tons of carbon per acre per year, as demonstrated in a review by myself and Jerry Schumann in 2007. We're going to look at the Western Great Plains rangelands here in the heart of North America. These rangeland systems are largely in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, and so they're dry systems characterized by arid and semi-arid environments. These systems have a high frequency of drought, as denoted there in the Palmer Drought Severity Index map. These areas have a high amount of time that they're in severe drought. They also have a long evolutionary history of grazing, primarily by bison and elk in the past, have been replaced by livestock, mostly cattle, in the recent past. They also have a history of fire, with fire return intervals on the 20 to 40-year range, and also have disturbances that modify ecosystem structure and function associated with the small mammal, the black-tailed prairie dog. Where is the carbon in these systems? They are largely upside-down forest. That is, instead of seeing all the carbon above ground like you do in the forest, it's below ground. 6% of the carbon is above ground, and 94% of the carbon is below ground in our systems, and most of that below ground carbon is recalcitrant. We look at the controls over soil carbon in these Western Great Plains rangeland systems. It's attributable to weather. That is, the precipitation patterns and amounts and temperatures really influencing the dynamics of carbon fluxes, and we'll showcase that with some carbon flux data forthcoming. Other major controls on longer time scales are climate and soil texture. climate again in these systems are arid and semi-arid, and we'll showcase the association of soil texture with soil carbon in an upcoming graph. Management that can affect soil carbon in these western Great Plains rangelands are grazing, fire, and cultivation. Grazing and fire primarily occur and influence carbon on the scale of decades, and we're going to showcase today, focus on the grazing aspects. Cultivation can have much more of a short-term effect, but also long-term, as showcased by the Homestead Acts, where some of those lands had to be plowed up and made better, and that resulted in primarily a major factor in contributing to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and large-scale degradation and soil loss in the western Great Plains. I'd like to showcase here the variability of the western Great Plains. I'm going to use the shortgrass steppe as a site here. This is our USDA Agriculture Research Services Central Plains Experimental Range. This is an LT-ARS site in northern Colorado near Nunn. A lot of year-to-year variability here. The picture in the upper center is kind of the picture of the classic shortgrass prairie, dominated by low-statured, low-growing C4 grass, Blue Grama bulgaricalis. High forage quality, lots of leaves, but again, low statured and a fibrous root system that accumulates soil carbon. In certain years with good precipitation in the spring and on soils, we can produce a lot of cool season grass. Upper left would showcase Hesperos stipa comata, or needle and thread, and its contributions to the shortgrass and mixed grass prairie. There can be a large amount of the forage produced in a given year. And again, depending on the precipitation patterns and amounts, we can have years that will express tremendous amount of plant diversity with a lot of forbs in the plant community. Conversely, the majority of the time we see the bottom row of photographs there where these systems can exhibit very dry conditions, dry to drought, often limiting forages here and producing situations where we may have to remove animals from these ecosystems because of low forage conditions. I'd like to get in some data here that now looks at net ecosystem exchange or carbon fluxes in the shortgrass steppe here at our LT-ARS site, the Central Plains Experimental Range. This was some data taken by Jack Morgan in the 96 through 2002, published in Tony Svekar's summary paper in 2008, and utilized the technology at the time, Bowen ratios, kind of the precursor to eddy covariant systems. This is on a set of property land that had been partly grazed, but was ungrazed during that time period when the net ecosystem exchange measurements occurred. And we see that there are annual values there ranging from essentially 0 to 1 year being 1 ton of carbon per acre per year measured by the Bowen ratio systems. And a clear association between precipitation and carbon gain. So precipitation in 1999 in the red rectangle was one of the highest years on record, and that's when we produced the 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. Very good growing season, very good year. Conversely, the following year, 2000, was a very dry year, a drought year, and that was a year showcased in the purple rectangle box where carbon exchange during that entire year was essentially 0. So we see kind of the high variability here in carbon exchange going on in shortgrass steppe associated with precipitation and weather variability. If we look at that same site, so this is more work done by Jack Morgan, published in 2016, again on a site that had been moderately grazed prior to the start of the study in 2001, and then ungrazed from 2001 through 2006, utilizing again the Bowen ratio methodology. Units here are in tons of carbon per acre per year. And we want to showcase the within season differences here. So we're going to look at dormant season, non-growing season. And the units here, if they're positive, that means carbon is moving from the soil back to the atmosphere. If they're negative, carbon is moving from the atmosphere into the soil. So consistently across the 6 years from 2001 through 2006, During the dormant or non-growing season, we were losing carbon through respiration from the soil to the atmosphere with a mean value across those 6 years about 0.2 tons of carbon per acre per year. We look at the growing season. For us, that's kind of mid-April through September in this system. And here we were accumulating carbon, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the soil in 5 of the 6 years. One year, we were zero, 2004 drought year, and another 2002 was near zero, another drought year. But still, across those 6 years, the average was 0.3 tons of carbon per acre per year during the growing season that we were accumulating carbon into the soil. If we sum that up and do an annual basis, then for the 6 years were sinks. We were taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil at a rate across those 6 years at about 0.1 tons of carbon per acre per year. Would like to note, though, that the purple small boxes indicate that 2 of the years we were actually sources. That is, carbon moved from the soil back to the atmosphere, and those 2 years were the drought years of 2002 and 2004. Now I'd like to move from carbon fluxes measured with instrumentation such as Bowen ratio or newer eddy covariance system to looking at soil carbon responses, both in the literature and then some site field measurements. First, let's look at the synthesis literature reviews, starting with the Milchunas and Lauenroth classic paper in 1993 and several other ones occurring since then. The clear aspects across these reviews have been that grazing is highly variable in its effects on soil carbon. Let's look then at individual sites. This is again the shortgrass prairie site, back to our USDA-ARS site, Central Plains Experimental Range. Some pictures here. This site has an average forage production of about 750 pounds per acre, but again, high variability and predominantly has the warm season grass, blue grama, as its dominant in the plant community. If we look at this site, we were very fortunate to have this site have long-term exclosures put in when the site was first initiated in 1939. It's also paired with that were some pastures that have long-term moderately grazed since then. So we have the comparison of ungrazed since 1939 and long-term moderately grazed since 1939. We sampled those soils in the early 2010s and looked at the association of silt and clay, soil texture, to total carbon in the upper left and organic carbon in the bottom left panels there. And there are clear associations that soil texture does influence soil carbon. Look to the right, we're going to look at the ability here because those treatments were in place prior to the development of the atomic bomb. And so when atomic bombs were developed and carbon-14 was released in the atmosphere, we could use that then as a natural tracer to look at the carbon changes in the system associated with that using the carbon-14 as a tracer. We sampled those soils, sent them into laboratories, and looked at the change in carbon-14 in those soils. Grazing did not change the soil carbon after those 80 years. There's no difference in the soil carbon amounts in the ungrazed versus the moderately grazed at the 8-inch depth for our sampling. That upper panel does showcase, however, that the majority of the samples are above zero, indicating that the carbon was being accumulated in our systems across those 80 years. It was just not impacted by grazing, again, at the 8-inch depth of our sampling for this event. We're going to look at some soil sampling on one of the classic sites for soil carbon in the northern mixed grass prairie. This is at our Agricultural Research Services site in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the High Plains Grasslands Research Station. This is a site that has a good mix of C3 and C4 grasses, about a 50-50 mix. It's a higher productivity site, about 1,400 pounds per acre, because of that greater abundance of cool season grasses. Here's a site that was part of the F.E. Warren Air Force Base prior to 1982. It had been ungrazed. Dick Hart, my predecessor, was able to utilize the site and institute a grazing experiment and started in 1982 with replicated treatments of season-long grazing. So these are grazing from June through the end of September with yearling cattle at light stocking rates that was determined to be 33% below the recommended rate, moderate, which was the recommended rate, and heavy, 33% above the recommended rate. Those grazing treatments have been employed since 1982 through the current years. Dick also maintained two 1-acre exclosures. We had the full continuum of grazing from ungrazed through light, through moderate, and up to heavy grazing. Although soil samples weren't taken in 1982 at the start of the study, Jerry Schumann, our soil scientist, did take soil samples in 1993, 12 years after the grazing, and it followed a period that was above average in terms of precipitation, so some very good years. Jerry sampled to a depth of 24 inches on some long-term permanently marked transects and found that soil carbon was similar between the light and heavy grazing treatments after those first 12 years, but it was greater in soil carbon in the heavy compared to the ungrazed. And that's because the heavy grazing had altered or changed the plant community and reduced the amount of the C3 plants and increase the amount of C4 plants, primarily Blue Grama, Bulgur, which is shorter stature but also has a more fibrous root system and accumulates carbon in the upper soil profile. In 2003, or 21 years after grazing, Jerry's postdoc at the time, Lockie Ingram, sampled the same plots in the same treatments, but that was after a period of years that had been below average. And so we had changed it from 10 years of being above average. Now these 10 years were largely below average in precipitation. And Lockie's results showcased that soil carbon remained unchanged from Jerry's sampling to his sampling with the light grazing and the ungrazed. So those treatments remained similar and unchanged. But soil carbon was lower now, 30% lower in the heavy grazing in 2003 compared to 1993, primarily as a result of those dry years increasing soil respiration and moving that carbon that had been accumulated in the roots of Blue Grama and shallow soil depths back to the atmosphere. The grazing-induced changes here are depicted in this nice figure put together by Lauren Perinsky in her publication in 2016 from the site. And I want to showcase the changes here. Let's start with the figure. If we start on the left, that's our heavy grazing. Then we move to moderate, move further to the right, that's light, and clear to the right, that's the ungrazed or no grazing situation. I want to showcase what happens on plant community changes associated with the institution of heavy grazing. Heavy grazing reduces the perennial cool season grasses. That is the pasm and Hiko. So pasm is Pascopyrum smithii, or western wheatgrass. Hiko is Hesperostipa comata, or needle and thread. And we can see that over that period of time, that perennial grasses in the exclosures were about 10% of the plant cover and reduced now to about 3% with heavy grazing. Litter, it went from about 60% of plant cover in the exclosure to down to 34% with heavy grazing. Now, heavy grazing does increase perennial C4 grasses, and that's Bulgur, Bulgur, right? And that went from 3 and 6-fold increase to 19% with heavy grazing. And also bare ground increased from 9 to 22%. So some fundamental changes that grazing induced in the plant communities had tremendous changes in influences on ecosystem structure and function. We were able to sample the same sites that Jerry Schumann and Lockie Ingram had sampled. We did that again in 2013. So now 31 years after the institution of the grazing treatments, but also following another decade where most of the years were below average precipitation and dry. Compared to the 2003 sampling of Lockie's, our soil carbon remained unchanged with heavy or ungrazed in this situation, but we lost carbon this time from the light grazing treatment, primarily associated with some annual plant invasions coming into that plant community. So again, the grazing-induced changes influencing plant community changes have an effect on soil carbon. We'd like to sample the same sets of soil transects this year. However, it's remained too dry. We're going to try to sample as soon as moisture occurs, and that would put us at the fourth major soil sampling. So after 40 plus years of grazing and having 4 different soil sampling intervals through there, tremendous data set with grazing, soils, and plant community information in terms of being able to put together the grazing by environment, by plant community changes timelines. Just in terms of insights related to soil carbon in the Western Great Plains, none of those studies that we've covered today, both in the shortgrass steppe or in the northern mixed grass prairie, had initial baseline soil carbon measurements. We actually don't know what the initial starting conditions were. Clearly, as we start studies, we need to have those baselines so we can have a true indicator of change. Also, there's lots of experiments out there that look at grazing treatments, perhaps on plant communities or livestock responses, but have not addressed soil carbon. So there's opportunities to sample those experiments for soil carbon responses. And I think I've been able to hammer home the point that our grazing-induced vegetation changes really interact with weather and precipitation patterns to influence soil carbon. And those are clearly some dynamic events occurring in these Western Great Plains ecosystems. I'd like to wrap up with just kind of the path forward, and this is summarized quite well in an article led by Sanderson and others in 2020. In the Western Great Plains, we really want to keep rangelands intact. We lose a large amount of that stored soil carbon when we convert rangelands to other land uses. 2, we like to strategically restore those former cultivated and degraded lands in the Western Great Plains, either lands that were part of the original Homestead Act or had been farmed and cultivated in the past. Can we strategically locate those, institute restoration reclamation efforts, and increase the soil reservoir, fill it back up with the carbon that had been lost through the tillage events? And can we look at the adaptive rangeland and livestock management here, really trying to adjust our livestock numbers in response to the weather and climate conditions that are currently occurring? Can we do that to ensure that we match more properly animal demand with the forage availability, and try to ensure that we have sufficient plant and litter cover to prevent soil losses and reduce the potential for soil carbon respiration back to the atmosphere under dry conditions? With that, thank you so much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Justin. That was a great presentation and really amazing long-term data sets that you have there, and long-term experiments, treatments as well. There are some questions in the chat that I see that you're answering. So anyone feel free to add more questions to the Q&A. And I'll just start with what's in the chat right now. Do you see promise from adaptive grazing for increasing soil carbon levels, and what evidence is there?
Yeah, I saw that question, Betsy. Great one from Jonathan. Jonathan, we have data in hand just coming back, addressing that in the shortgrass steppe, where we were able to take baseline measurements in 2013 and implement an adaptive grazing experiment, and then have sampled those same soil transects after 10 years. So that data is coming back to us shortly. We'll be able to answer it. In terms of livestock responses, we saw a decrease, though, with our adaptive grazing in our system because of the higher stock density in that system. Again, we're grazing season long in those aspects. So seasonal grazing some in that shortgrass from mid-May through early October. So we're not grazing it year round, and we're grazing with yearlings rather than cow calves. So I think there are some context basis here. One is adaptive management probably parlays much stronger with cow calves when you have year long and can impose that longer rest and change that rest and grazing periods. But it'd be interesting to see our soil carbon responses. Those periods of the 10 years, quite a few of those early on were wet, and then the last 4 were dry. So we'll be able to see the influence of that variability on our soil carbon, Jonathan.
So you talked a lot about how grazing affects the ratios of the C3, C4 dominant species and how that is potentially a driver of soil carbon. Do you see any other mechanisms like soil exposure or soil compaction that results from the grazing management that could affect the soil carbon?
Yeah, Betsy, clearly on our side, what we're presenting is largely concentrations from the bulk density side. Yes, Jerry and others showcase that as you move that from the exposure to the heavy grazing, we would see increases in soil bulk density, especially at those shallower depths, 0 to 5 centimeters or up to 2 inches, and then the depth below that up to 6 inches. So looking at the pool sizes, it can be influenced by both changes in concentrations and in the bulk density. And we continue to see those differences in bulk density continue throughout the length of that experiment up to the 40+ years. So we need to take that into account in terms of what bulk density then does for soil compaction, water infiltration, and the whole nutrient cycling aspects of those systems.
Here's another question from the Q&A. How were light and heavy grazing treatments defined, and did the stocking rates change over time during the course of the study?
Yeah, so the light and heavy were based off of the NRCS recommended moderate rate. And so that was our benchmark. And then light was 33% lower, and the heavy was 33% higher, is what Dick had done on those. And those remain consistent then over the now 43 years of the grazing experiment.
Here's another question. That you mentioned non-native invasive grasses. Were those affected by the grazing treatments, and what influence did the invasion have on the soil carbon?
Yeah, so we're in our system with heavy grazing, we have that increase in blue grama, which negates, in our case, really the invasion by, in our case, annual cheatgrass. So we're seeing cheatgrass coming in on the light and ungrazed situations here, not in the moderate heavy grazing, and then also annual forbs in those two systems. So grazing, in our case, reduces the abundance of cheatgrass because of the blue grama domination. So it's kind of an interesting aspect. We're seeing some reductions in the upper depths of soil carbon associated with the invasion by those annual grasses in the light and ungrazed situation. So clearly have an impact on soil carbon dynamics in shallow depths.
Do they affect the lability of the soil carbon? Any drivers of the lability in any of your treatments?
Betsy, we don't have any data on that yet. We're hoping when we do sample here in the 43rd, 44th year to look at that sort of changes with the great group out of Colorado State, Paige Stanley and Francesca Truffo's group, looking at the MALM and the PALM carbon and looking at that sort in terms of soil carbon pools and the liability of it. So we'll have that data hopefully in a couple more years to answer that question.
Look at these. Do you think that the shifts in the plant communities are solely the result of grazing?
In our case, yeah, it's pretty demonstrable. In our case, many other places around where the grazing changes that plant community from a mixed C3, 6, 4, pushes it to more of a C4 dominant community with as heavy grazing increases. And as you remove the grazing pressure, switches it back to more of a C3 dominant plant community. So it's pretty consistent in the Western Great Plains across numerous sites that grazing can have that effect, again, on a decadal type scale for the plant communities.
Jocelyn asks for a clarification about the Ingram et al. 2008 results. You said that the reason for SOC loss may have been higher soil respiration. Was that measured directly, or could it just be the relative balance of inputs versus outputs. For example, inputs may have been lower due to drought, while respiration may not have necessarily been higher.
Yeah, great question, Jocelyn. Yeah, Lockie actually did a pile of laboratory measurements and looked at the microbial biomass, respiration, and nitrogen mineralization, and all of those were lower in the heavy grazing and higher in the light grazing. So pretty good experimental evidence to showcase that the respiration rates were driving that. But you're right, the inputs were also lower. So I think cumulative, both of those had an effect on the nutrient cycling.
The factors at play. Can you speak to the power of your sample sizes in the SOC data? Given the large variability in SOC, is there reason to believe that the lack of response could be attributed to too few samples rather than lack of change?
Yeah, Paige, this is a classic problem, right? Across most of the grazing experiments, usually put in without consultation with soil scientists up front, right? We have two replications of the grazing treatments. Long-term standardized transects. Good thing is that on those 50-meter transects where the plant data is obtained, Jerry Schumann initially did take 5 subsamples along that 50-meter transect. So we do have good amount of taking account of the variability within that 50-meter strip. But again, there's only 2 of those, 2 reps. So Paige, you're correct, right? We know the inherent variability of these rangeland ecosystems with soils, topography, and everything else. So sampling design, I wish we could go back in time, right, in 1982 and redo it. But the power of this study is that it is temporally, we have the samples over time, so we can look at changes with time across those 4 different sampling events. 4th one to occur hopefully next spring.
Just bombarding you with questions, Justin. This is great. Thank you so much to everyone for all of your questions. Any idea about the relative effects of changes in root biomass versus litter change versus plant species change?
Yeah, great question. Again, so Jerry Schumann and Lockie both took the root biomass. Even within those first 10 years, we saw a tremendous change in root biomass going from the ungrazed to the heavy grazing. So the root biomass shifted into the shallower depths. So blue grama is a shallow rooted plant. And so in the top 6 inches of the soil carbon profile, we saw much more root biomass with heavy grazing than we did in the deeper profiles. That was good for the first 10 years when we had abundant precipitation. However, when it dried up, those roots then decayed. When we did get precipitation pulses, respiration occurred. And so we changed dynamics there. We continue to see that same sort of root biomass pattern now where light grazing has heavier or has more roots deeper in the soil profile, whereas the heavy grazing continues to have more roots shallower in the root profile. So a clear contrast with grazing influence plant species, which then increases and changes alters the distribution of the root biomass.
I noticed in that one study you had going down to 8 inches. Would you recommend to sample deeper than that?
In that sample, we would love to sample deeper, Betsy, but the prohibitive cost of the carbon-14 samples at that time, $250 a whack, precluded us from deeper sample depths. So sometimes you have to balance right resources, both labor and soil sampling versus the financial cost of doing the analytical aspects.
Here's a question I also had too. Well, one question is, does the uptake that you're seeing, the uptake of carbon, offset the methane emissions from the cattle that are grazing there? And have you ever looked at that greenhouse gas balance where you account for methane emissions from cattle as well as the ecosystem respiration?
So great question, Hillary. Not in this study, but we've done some work that we're just getting ready to submit out of the shortgrass step where we've looked at that full system, soil carbon, right, methane emissions from cattle, and then methane uptake from the soil. So in our systems, we are in sinks for methane. from the atmosphere to the soil, so that's great. However, when you put it all together, we're still not being able to attribute for all of the methane emissions associated with the livestock when we take into account the methane sink of the soils or the carbon sequestration aspect. So yes, we're continuing to be a net source back to the atmosphere on the greenhouse gas at this point.
Is that the same? I mean, I guess the different grazing regimes would differ in their sink strength or their balance.
Slightly so, Betsy. Yeah. And of course, in the heavier grazing, of course, more animals as well, right? So we have to take that into account when you do the full balance side. But that's where we'd like to go next, is looking at total beef production related to the greenhouse gas sink or source aspect of the systems.
Let's see. Here's a question. Are you doing adaptive management at Cheyenne stations?
Thanks, Rebecca. We are not doing that we're doing flexible stalking, which is some form of adaptive management. We're not moving animals across pastures associated there. That work is all done at the shortgrass prairie at our USDA-ARS site. Just because of larger land mass there, we have almost 7-fold increase in acres there compared to the Cheyenne site.
Here's a question about fire. I also had this question, like, you looked a lot at grazing. Do you look at other management that you do in the Great Plains on soil carbon? So Courtney's question is, could you talk a bit about the potential role of fire in Western Plains soil carbon? Do you see fire functionally as the same as grazing in terms of potential to change plant communities, but on much longer timescales? And you mentioned return intervals of 20 to 40 years.
Yeah, Courtney, we don't have any data on fire and soil carbon in our study systems yet, but we have done some patch burn grazing. David Augustine led that work in the middle 2000s, where we burn a quarter of a parcel of ground and then move that around over the 4 years. And we saw some significant changes in the plant community with fire. Now, we were burning in the fall after the plants had gone dormant, not in the early spring where a lot of the other prescribed fires have been going on. We saw that we could remove cactus, which in our system down there is a major ecosystem structure and function plant. Take that out of the system, at least short term, for up to about a decade because of the direct effects of the burning, but also indirectly when we burned it and we removed the spines, antelope in our system would come along and consume those cactus cladodes over the winter period. So that's largely the fundamental aspect of plant communities. We did see a forage quality bump the following year after burning, but that was pretty short-lived up into May through early June. And that's kind of the structural aspects, forage quality side, and our livestock gains were either similar or higher on those areas that had been patch burn grazed versus areas not burned. So it's hard to look at patch burn or fire sequences on soil carbon just because we don't have the history of those and well-documented treatments.
Here's a question from Carlos. Are you evaluating the carbon captured in the roots of grasses under the different grazing management? And I know you showed that one profile where you mentioned underground forests. So does that underground forest change in your different grazing management?
Well, Carlos, we're not directly doing the carbon from those roots. First of all, as Paige alluded to, our sampling is pretty poor in terms of capturing the dynamics of the heterogeneity on the landscape. Second of all, removing roots from soils is highly tedious and laborious. And, I'm a range scientist, not a soil scientist, but I think good things to think about is how do we actually sample roots? How do we collect the carbon in that? We know that the carbon in the roots is fairly constant, about 44%. So if we can just collect root biomass, we can make pretty good fundamental changes in terms of just putting carbon budgets together. Our hope is to continue to look at soil carbon and root depths in collaboration with some folks like Paige and others. Paige does have a large study with the FFAR looking at the 3M project across numerous sites, both on ranches, clearly some integrated sites where they're going to be having a lot of data in the next 4 to 5 years addressing that sort of question. So look forward for Paige Stanley and her group looking at that.
How deep is the soil parent material in these two rangeland systems, and how does that impact rooting depth and where the carbon ends up?
Yeah, May, great question. Some of the I'll say the upper parts of the topography, if we're looking at the tops of those kind of ridges, soils are 10 to 20 inches deep is all. You get down in the loamier parts, we can be down to 1 to 2 meters before we hit some parent material. In both systems, however, we have a pretty good calcium layer at about 30 to 40 centimeters, so about 12 inches down. Calcium carbonate plays a big role in our systems, sometimes inhibiting the root growth deeper in the soil profile. So I think those two things really, and again, we don't have a good depth of that in terms of a lot of soil sampling, but fundamentally we know that those Katina approaches are pretty clear in our systems, shallow soil depths on top, and then accumulation of soil as we go down into the kind of swale parts of our systems.
Here's a question about what will you use as a baseline measurement to measure restoration effect? I don't know if you are doing restoration there with reseeding or.
We are not, but there are some long-term restoration efforts that we'll look at. Deb Coffin Peters did work down in the shortgrass prairie that had been plowed in the 1930s, and so she had some sites where she looked at restoration effects from the 1930s against native unplowed, and it was taking well over 70 years in that dry system to accumulate similar amounts of plant materials, plant community changes, and the soil carbon profile still was not back to the same baseline as it was after 70 years of that intense tillage in the 1930s.
How do we get the extension message across to manage grazing intensity, partly increased cow size? Do you think commercial producers' awareness is good about these topics?
Yeah, Larry, I think all of us have that same sort of concern when we start talking about stocking rates or grazing intensities. And I think a lot of producers, if you ask them what their cow size is, it's clearly an underestimation of what their true cow size is. We know that from genetics data, right, the breed data, that Angus now are the largest cows and well over 1,400 pounds. So if we continue to stock like Grandpa and Dad did on 60 cows on a parcel of ground, clearly we've increased stocking rate and grazing intensity on those systems and need to account for that. So I think in our experimental studies, we are doing that. We're making sure that we are ratcheting down numbers to compensate for the larger cow size and trying to make sure that our stocking rates on the animal unit basis are clearly comparable over time. But I think producers are starting to see the manifest of that as they're starting to have some dry or drought conditions and looking at truly their cow size. Okay.
Do you see changes in the C3 versus C4 ratios happening due to climate change? And if so, how would this potentially change? How would this affect the livestock carbon management in the region?
Yeah, Dave Khalil, thank you for answering. We have, again, on our site here in Cheyenne, one of the field sites where long-term free air carbon dioxide enrichment study was ongoing, and Jack Morgan, Dana Blumenthal, David Augustine led that. Saw some interesting changes with CO2. If you just increase CO2, you increase the abundance of C3 grasses, right? In that system, higher water availability, deeper soil depths in terms of those roots going there. When you increase the warming, you went more to a C4 dominance, so back to blue grama because, again, of the drying out of the system. And when you add both, right, they kind of counteract. CO2 counteracts the drying effects of the warming. And so in that case, the system stayed very similar over time. Now, what we did see is that forage production did slightly increase, but David Augustine's paper showed that the forage quality decreases as you add in the CO2 effects. So as we look at that, it's no wonder why we often see some summer slumps in our forage quality, as those plants are, one, growing faster, maturing faster in the phenological stage, but also just in general, the forage quality is down. And so we may see some strategic supplementation of protein by producers in the midsummer to compensate for that in an adaptive fashion to increase their livestock weight gains.
All right, well, we're hitting 1:45, so I just want to say thank you to Justin for your seminar, and thank you to all the participants for your questions. Thank you for attending this session of the Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon webinar series. Please note that a link to a recording of today's presentation will be available on our webpage, and we'll save these questions that weren't answered, and maybe we can have Justin get to them later. Please plan to join us on November 18th for our next webinar on long-term carbon responses to grazing and brush management in a semi-arid Arizona rangeland by Dr. Heather Throop. So we hope to see you then. And thank you, and please fill out the poll before you leave. Thank you.